Lake Superior began to pull down in August. The first person to notice was not a scientist or a geologist. It was a dock foreman named Arvid Koski, a Finnish immigrant who had spent 17 years loading ore carriers at a port on the northern shore of Michigan. He watched the water every day. He knew its seasonal rhythms, the normal range of rise and fall. In late August of 1925, the surface began doing something he had never seen. In the first week of September, it dropped 8 feet below normal. By the 14th, it was down 18. The harbour became impassable for deep draft vessels. Docks that had stood at the waterline for decades hung over exposed rock. Stones that had not seen air since the basin filled after the last glacier stood in the open and dried in the September sun. On the 14th, Koski walked the shore east of the port to assess conditions for the harbour authority. Half a mile past the last pier, on a section of lake bed that a week earlier had been underwater, he saw something that had no business being on the floor of Lake Superior. A wall. Not a bedrock outcrop, not glacial till, not a tumble of loose stone. A wall of laid blocks, roughly 3 feet high, running east to west in a straight line, and extending in both directions farther than he could see, one end disappearing into the remaining water, the other curving behind a bend in the shore. He stood at it for 20 minutes. Then he walked back to the harbour office and picked up the telephone. The next morning, 2 men from the Army Corps of Engineers arrived. After that, the silence began. He was not the only person who saw the wall. In the days between his discovery and what came next, at least a dozen residents walked out to the exposed lake bed to look at what the receding water had uncovered. Several of them later gave accounts, and while the details vary in small ways, the height of the wall, the colour of the stone, the core description is consistent across every one of them. It was made of flat rectangular blocks of dark stone, fitted together without mortar. The blocks were roughly uniform in size, approximately 2 feet long, 1 foot high, and of a thickness that could not be determined because the wall was partially embedded in lake bed sediment on both sides. The top course was level. The visible face was flat. The joints between blocks were tight and vertical, running straight from the top of the wall to the sediment line, without the branching or irregularity that characterizes natural fracturing. A local schoolteacher named Elsa Lindqvist, who walked out on the 15th, described the structure in a letter to her sister in Duluth as looking like something a mason had built, except that it was on the bottom of the lake and no mason had ever been there. A commercial fisherman named Tauno Kinnunen, who had worked the waters east of Marquette for 30 years, said he had dragged nets across the area hundreds of times and never snagged on anything. Whatever it was, it had been sitting flush with the lake floor, buried under sediment, invisible until the water dropped far enough to expose it. Kinnunen estimated the visible section at roughly a quarter mile. The full extent was unknown because both ends were submerged. When asked later how deep the sediment around the base appeared to be, he said it looked like it had been there longer than the mud. Lake Superior is the largest freshwater lake on Earth by surface area and the 3rd largest by volume. It sits in a basin carved by glacial ice during the Pleistocene, and its current shoreline has been roughly stable for approximately 3,000 years. Before that, the water level fluctuated significantly as the weight of the retreating glacier allowed the land beneath it to rebound, a process called isostatic adjustment that continued for millennia after the ice was gone. During certain phases of this adjustment, the lake level was substantially lower than it is today. Geologists have identified ancient shorelines on the lake bed that correspond to periods when the surface stood 30, 50, even 100 feet below its present elevation. The section of lake floor where Koski found the wall sits at a depth that, under normal conditions, places it under approximately 20 feet of water. 20 feet of depth corresponds to a shoreline phase that ended roughly 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Anything built on that surface would have been constructed during a period when the ground was dry and the water had not yet risen to cover it. 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, the copper mines on the Keweenaw Peninsula and Isle Royale were at the height of their operation. The same lake, the same shoreline, the same period. Whoever was mining copper on the ridges above the water was living on a lakeshore that extended far beyond its present boundary, on ground that is now submerged, in a landscape that no longer exists above the surface. What Koski found was sitting on that ground. It had been sitting there, under water and under sediment, since the water rose to cover it. And it would have stayed there indefinitely if the lake had not, for one anomalous month in 1925, pulled back far enough to show what it had been hiding. Arvid Koski was born in Ostrobothnia, Finland, in 1879 and came to Michigan's Upper Peninsula in 1908, part of the wave of Finnish immigration that built the mining and shipping towns along Lake Superior's southern shore. He worked the Marquette docks from his first week in the country until his retirement in 1941. His employment record with the Harbour Commission is preserved in the Marquette County Archives and shows 33 years of continuous service without interruption. He was not a man who reported things he had not seen. The account survives because of a journalist named Howard Gunderson, who worked for the Marquette Mining Journal. Gunderson interviewed Koski on September 16th, 2 days after the discovery and 1 day after the Corps engineers arrived. The interview was not published as a feature. It appeared as 4 paragraphs in a column about the low water conditions affecting harbour operations, buried between a shipping schedule and a notice about dock repairs. Gunderson described the structure in Koski's words: laid stone, flat top, tight joints, running east to west, and noted that the Corps had visited the site and was assessing the situation. The column ran on September 17th. No follow-up appeared. Gunderson continued working at the Mining Journal until 1938. He never wrote about the wall again. Years later, his son, interviewed for a local history project in the 1970s, said his father had mentioned the structure several times at home, but had been told by someone, he could not remember who, that the story was not worth pursuing. The son described his father's tone when discussing it as careful. Not frightened, careful. The tone of a man who knew the difference between a story that couldn't be published and a story that shouldn't be. The 2 engineers from the Corps arrived on the morning of September 15th and spent most of the day at the site. They did not bring surveying equipment. They did not bring a photographer, though cameras were standard issue for Corps field assessments in that period. What they brought, according to the foreman, who watched them from the dock, was a measuring tape, a notebook, and a pair of binoculars. They walked the length of the visible wall, which he estimated took them approximately 40 minutes. They returned to their vehicle without speaking to anyone at the harbour office. On September 16th, a work crew arrived from the Corps station at Sault Ste. Marie, 160 miles to the east. The crew brought a boat, cabling equipment, and explosives. On the morning of September 17th, the same day Gunderson's column appeared in the Mining Journal, the crew began drilling charges into the stonework. By the evening of September 18th, the stonework had been reduced to rubble. 3 days. 72 hours from the arrival of the first engineers to the detonation of the last charge. The official explanation, entered into the Corps operational log for the district, was obstruction removal for navigation safety. The log is preserved in the National Archives facility in Chicago. The entry is 4 lines long. It does not describe the obstruction. It does not note its composition, its dimensions, or its orientation. It notes the grid coordinates, the date of removal, and the method, controlled demolition. Navigation safety is a legitimate function of the Corps of Engineers. Obstructions in navigable waterways are routinely cleared. But the wall was half a mile from the shipping channel, on an exposed section of lake bed that was dry at the time and would be submerged again within weeks as the water returned to its normal level. You do not dynamite an obstruction that the water is about to bury for you, unless the concern is not navigation, unless the concern is that someone else might see it before the water comes back. The operational log at the National Archives contains the entry. The Marquette Harbour Commission files contain the foreman's verbal report, noted in the minutes of the September 15th meeting as low water exposure of submerged geological formation east of Pier 7. The Mining Journal archive contains Gunderson's column. These three documents are the entire institutional record of the wall. There is no geological survey. There is no photographic record in the core files for the district for September 1925. There is no after-action report describing what was demolished, which is unusual because core protocol for controlled demolitions in navigable waterways required a post-removal assessment documenting the site condition, the volume of material removed, and the method of disposal. That assessment does not exist for this operation. The rubble from the demolition was not removed from the site. It was left on the lake bed, where the rising water covered it within 3 weeks. No sample of the stone was retained for analysis. No measurement of the wall's full extent was recorded. Only Kinnanen's estimate of a quarter-mile of visible section. The operational log classifies the material as geological formation, which is a classification, not a description. Geological formations are not normally dynamited. They are not normally the subject of a crew deployment from a station 160 miles away. They are not normally demolished in 72 hours, without photographic documentation in the files of an agency that photographed everything it built and everything it removed. The record does not say the wall was constructed. It does not say it was natural. It says almost nothing. And in a system that documented the removal of every sandbar and snag in every harbour on the Great Lakes, saying almost nothing is the loudest thing the record does. Lake Superior has revealed things before. In 1903, a low water event exposed stone formations on the lake bed near Copper Harbour at the tip of the Keweenaw Peninsula, roughly 80 miles west of Marquette. A mining engineer named Strand documented them as possible extensions of the ancient mining complex and noted their linear arrangement. The water rose before any formal investigation could be conducted. In 1940, a fisherman near Whitefish Point reported seeing what he described as a stone pavement on the lake floor through unusually clear water at a depth of approximately 15 feet. He reported it to the Coast Guard. No record of a follow-up exists. The pattern along Superior is the same pattern found beneath every Great Lake. Structures and formations on the lake bed that correspond to periods when the water was lower and the ground was dry. The stone circles found 40 feet down in Grand Traverse Bay on Lake Michigan, the hunting structures on the floor of Lake Huron, the ancient shorelines and campsites that dot the submerged terraces of every basin in the system, the Ojibwe, whose territory includes the southern shore of Lake Superior where Koski found the wall, have a tradition that the lake was once smaller and that people lived on land that is now underwater. The tradition describes stone structures on that land, walls, enclosures, gathering places, built by people who were there before the Ojibwe arrived. The elders do not say who those people were. They say the structures were already old when the water came and took them. The water took them slowly, over centuries, as the basin filled. But Superior does not always keep what it takes. Every few decades, when conditions align, it pulls back for a season and lets the old ground breathe. In September of 1925, it pulled back far enough and long enough for a dock foreman walking the shore to see what the elders had always said was there. Then the water came back, and someone made sure that what it uncovered would not be there the next time it receded. Elsa Lindqvist's letter to her sister survived because the sister kept it. It was found in 1989 by Lindqvist's great-niece during an estate clearance in Duluth, and donated to the St. Louis County Historical Society, where it sits in a folder of miscellaneous correspondence. The letter describes the wall in plain language, includes a rough sketch showing the blocks and their arrangement, and mentions that several people visited the site before the work crew arrived. The sketch shows approximately 20 blocks in 3 courses, with vertical joints between them and a level top. It is not an architectural drawing. It is a school teacher's careful observation, rendered in pencil on the back of a piece of stationery. The foreman never wrote his account down. He told it to Gunderson, who published 4 paragraphs, and he told it to his family, who repeated it in the way that families repeat stories that matter, not as news, not as evidence, but as something that happened to someone they knew. His granddaughter, interviewed in 2003 for an Upper Peninsula oral history project, said her grandfather spoke of the structure without drama. He described it the way he described everything, precisely, briefly, and without speculation. He said it was built. He said it was old. He said they destroyed it. And he said that of all the things he had seen the lake do in 40 years, the strangest was not the discovery itself, but how fast the men came to destroy it. Not what he found, the speed. That was what he carried for the rest of his life. Not what he found, but how quickly it was taken away. The lake is back where it belongs. It has been at or near its normal level since October of 1925, and the section of lake bed where Koski walked is under 20 feet of cold, dark water. The rubble from the demolition is still there, broken stones scattered across the sediment where the stonework once stood. Sonar technology, capable of mapping submerged stone formations in detail, has existed for decades. A side-scan survey of the site east of Marquette could determine whether the rubble shows the characteristics of laid masonry or natural fracture. It could determine whether the fragments match the local bedrock or were placed there from a different source. It could determine whether additional wall sections remain intact beneath the sediment beyond the limits of what was visible in 1925. That survey has not been conducted. The operational log is in Chicago. The Lindqvist letter is in Duluth. The Gunderson column is in the Mining Journal archive in Marquette. His granddaughter is still alive. The pieces of this story sit in 4 different rooms across 3 states, and no one has laid them on the same table. The Corps demolished a 1/4 mile of stone wall on an exposed lake bed in 72 hours, filed a 4-line entry in an operational log, skipped the post-removal assessment, and never mentioned it again. The rising water covered the evidence 3 weeks later and has not uncovered it since. But it will drop again. It has dropped before, because the forces that move water in the Great Lakes Basin operate on cycles that no agency controls. When it does, the old ground will reappear. And the question is whether, the next time the water pulls back and the stones show through the sediment, anyone will be standing on the shore who knows what was there before, and what was done to it, and how fast.